It all began with a ripple. Not a storm, not a dramatic explosion, just a quiet ripple across international grain markets. But that ripple, in a matter of days, grew into a shockwave. A shockwave that would shake the pillars of America's wheat industry, force global buyers to rethink long-standing contracts, and turn Canada into the unlikely golden child of global grain trade. The story of how U.S. wheat began to face rejection across multiple global markets isn't just about bad crops or a simple export ban. No, it's a complex web of deteriorating quality, economic sanctions, strained diplomatic ties, pesticide concerns, and perhaps most importantly, trust. Trust, once broken, is the hardest thing to earn back. And the United States is learning that the hard way right now. In the past, the U.S. was regarded as a dominant force in the world grain market. When people thought wheat, they thought Kansas. They thought the Great Plains. They thought golden fields swaying under the wide-open American sky. U.S. wheat was synonymous with reliability, with safety, with consistency. From Egyptian bread factories to Japanese noodle companies, American wheat was a staple, an expectation, a guarantee. But over the last 2 years, that narrative has begun to change. First quietly, whispers in trading houses in Singapore and Shanghai. Then loudly, abrupt cancellations from Nigeria, Morocco, and even traditional allies like South Korea. Reports emerged, shipments of U.S. wheat being returned, refused at ports. Not for lack of quantity, but for concerns over quality. Lab tests revealed pesticide residues that exceeded international limits. Some shipments had alarming levels of glyphosate, a weed killer banned or heavily restricted in many countries. Others had mold due to improper storage. And a few carried strains of genetically modified wheat, something strictly regulated or outright banned in several nations. Suddenly, American wheat wasn't a safe bet. It was a liability. And as international confidence began to erode, buyers scrambled to find alternatives. Enter Canada. Quiet, humble, snow-covered Canada. Known more for maple syrup and hockey than agriculture on the world stage. But Canadian farmers have been growing some of the highest quality wheat on the planet for years, especially durum wheat, prized for pasta and baking. For years, Canada's wheat exports hovered just below the radar. But when global buyers began looking for consistency, purity, and cleaner farming practices, they looked north. And they liked what they saw. Canada, with its tighter pesticide regulations and rigorous export testing standards, suddenly became the new darling of the global wheat market. Countries like Indonesia, which once imported 4 million metric tons of U.S. wheat annually, slashed their American orders and doubled Canadian contracts. Egypt, a longtime U.S. wheat buyer, began purchasing in bulk from Saskatchewan. Even Italy, with its strict standards for pasta wheat, diverted orders away from North Dakota and into Alberta. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but happened fast enough to leave American exporters stunned. Shipments sat at docks unclaimed. Grain elevators across the Midwest overflowed. Prices plummeted. And yet, across the border in Canada, wheat prices soared. Farmers there couldn't keep up with demand. Contracts flooded in. Some were paid in advance, something almost unheard of in the volatile grain trade. So what went wrong in the U.S.? Why did American wheat, once the global standard, become the industry's cautionary tale? For starters, deregulation played a major role. Over the past decade, several U.S. administrations relaxed oversight on agricultural practices. What was once a tightly monitored industry became more profit-driven, cutting corners where possible. Storage facilities weren't updated. Shipping protocols became lax. The rush to harvest meant crops weren't properly dried. And with more pressure to produce volume, many farmers turned to chemical solutions, herbicides, pesticides, growth stimulants. The problem? The rest of the world didn't lower their standards. In fact, they raised them. The European Union, for example, outlawed certain pesticides that were still legal in the U.S. Southeast Asian nations, imposed stricter grain testing protocols. African countries, with rising awareness about food safety, demanded better certification. And when U.S. exporters couldn't, or wouldn't, meet those standards, buyers had no choice but to walk away. Another factor? Trade politics. The U.S. has been embroiled in trade disputes with multiple countries: China, Mexico, the European Union, and more. Tariffs, counter-tariffs, and diplomatic tension made some buyers uneasy about relying too heavily on U.S. agricultural imports. When food security is at stake, nobody wants their wheat shipments to become pawns in a political chess game. Then came the weather. Climate change has battered America's wheat belt. Historic droughts, unpredictable frost patterns, flooding in places where it never used to flood. All of it conspired to affect the consistency of harvests. One year, yields were too low. The next, they were high, but the protein content was off. Wheat isn't just about quantity, it's about quality. And American quality was increasingly hit or miss. Meanwhile, Canada invested. They developed cold-resistant wheat strains. They built climate-resilient infrastructure. They partnered with indigenous communities for land access. And most importantly, they listened to the global market's concerns about health, safety, and sustainability. Canadian wheat wasn't just abundant. It was certified clean, sustainable, and ethically sourced. And as global buyers began to rethink their long-term supply chains, Canada became the new gold standard. Of course, the ripple effect doesn't stop at farmers and ports. Entire industries are now feeling the shockwaves. American agricultural equipment manufacturers are seeing lower demand. Shipping companies are rerouting vessels away from U.S. Gulf ports and toward Vancouver and Prince Rupert. Fertilizer companies are adjusting their forecasts. And in Washington, D.C., policymakers are scrambling. Lobbyists from a National Association of Wheat Growers are demanding stricter export standards. Senators from Kansas, Nebraska, and Montana are calling for emergency funding. There's even talk of renegotiating pesticide regulations to align with international norms. But will it be enough? Can the U.S. win back trust? That's the real question. Because the damage isn't just economic, it's reputational. And reputational damage is the hardest to undo. In Indonesia, bakers are already rebranding their products with Canadian wheat inside. In Tunisia, flour companies are printing Canadian flags on their packaging. In Japan, noodle makers are proudly boasting about the switch to Saskatchewan-grown grain. What once was a silent commodity, just wheat, is now a badge of pride. And the U.S., for all its agricultural legacy, is on the outside looking in. Yet not everyone is giving up. A new generation of American farmers is pushing back. They're switching to organic methods. They're lobbying for independent testing. They're forming cooperatives to meet EU standards. There's a quiet movement rising from the ashes, a hope that maybe, just maybe, America can reclaim its place. But hope takes time, and trust even longer. Until then, Canada's wheat fields are blooming, not just with grain, but with global opportunity. As American exporters watch their market share shrink, the silence in Midwestern grain elevators became deafening. Farmers who once shipped thousands of tons across oceans were now staring at mountains of unsold wheat, wondering what went wrong, and if things would ever return to how they once were. But the truth was clear. The world had changed. And America, for all its might, failed to keep pace. Let's break down one particularly devastating event, an incident that shook the confidence of international buyers and made headlines across multiple continents. A massive shipment of wheat from the port of New Orleans was bound for South Korea. It was expected to arrive and be processed into bread flour within a week. But upon inspection at the port in Busan, South Korean officials detected excessive pesticide residue, triple the allowable limit. South Korea immediately canceled the contract and filed a diplomatic complaint. The cargo was returned, costing U.S. exporters millions. But more importantly, it sent a loud message to other nations. Something is seriously wrong with American wheat. Other countries took notice. One by one, government agencies around the globe began testing their American imports more aggressively. And with each failed inspection, a new door opened for Canada. It wasn't just about quality anymore. It was about reliability, predictability, and the assurance that the food being fed to millions of citizens was safe. Canada, seized the moment with calculated precision. Ottawa's Ministry of Agriculture launched a global marketing campaign, Canada Grows Clean. They targeted African nations, Middle Eastern importers, Asian megabuyers, and even the EU, promising not just wheat, but wheat grown with integrity. Canadian diplomats sat with agricultural ministers in Lagos, Riyadh, Jakarta, and Berlin. Samples were handed out. Laboratory results were openly shared. It wasn't just trade, it was trust-building diplomacy backed by science and transparency. Within a year, Canada's wheat exports increased by 37%. By the end of the second year, that number hit 53%. Meanwhile, back in the U.S., political blame games were underway. Governors blamed federal agencies. Lobbyists blamed environmental activists. Exporters blamed farmers. Farmers blamed the climate. But amidst all the finger-pointing, little was actually being done to fix the root problems. Let's not forget the American farmer here, the one stuck in the middle of a global storm. Many of them were hard-working, honest people doing their best to feed the world. But they were also victims of a system that rewarded quantity over quality, that subsidized speed over sustainability, that allowed outdated storage methods and overlooked contamination risks. One wheat farmer from Kansas, Jacob Turner, told a local news outlet, "We're doing everything we can. But when the elevators are full, the buyers walk away, and the government's only solution is a short-term loan, it feels like we're being punished for things beyond our control." Turner's words resonated with thousands. A quiet wave of protest began to rise, farmers demanding that the USDA set stricter quality standards to match international ones. They wanted better testing, government-backed modernization of storage facilities, and an overhaul of export practices. But Washington was slow to respond. At the same time, buyers from unexpected nations began turning their attention toward Canada as their primary supplier. Countries like Bangladesh, which had historically relied on U.S. wheat for food relief programs, shifted toward Canadian sources after testing revealed cleaner results and more consistent nutritional content. Some buyers even began using the phrase North American wheat in contracts, intentionally vague, but often defaulting to Canadian when the choice was available. It was a quiet erasure of U.S. dominance, one contract at a time. And it wasn't just about grain. This shift had massive geopolitical implications. Grain is power. Countries use wheat to feed their people, stabilize their economies, and in many cases, avoid famine. When the U.S. was the dominant exporter, it held a unique kind of influence, a soft power rooted in agriculture. But when buyers turned to Canada, that power shifted. Canada began playing a larger role in food diplomacy. Wheat for infrastructure deals were signed with African nations. Humanitarian grain shipments, once a U.S. specialty, were now carried on ships bearing the maple leaf. Canadian flags were seen at UN food summits, trade expos, and emergency relief hubs. It was a subtle but undeniable shift in the balance of global agricultural influence. This also raised eyebrows in Washington, where policymakers suddenly realized they were losing one of their quietest but most powerful tools of foreign policy. The American media began reporting on the crisis, calling it Wheatgate. Editorials questioned why such a massive industry had been allowed to collapse so quietly. Investigations were launched into pesticide usage, falsified export records, and internal USDA whistleblowers. One bombshell report by an independent watchdog revealed that certain wheat shipments had been green-tagged for export despite failing safety checks. Corners had been cut, paperwork had been forged, and the consequences were now global. But while America scrambled to fix its fractured image, Canada continued rising. Saskatchewan alone became a hub of economic growth. Small towns that once struggled now boomed with new infrastructure. Grain terminals expanded. Train lines extended. Universities launched agricultural science programs. Tech startups developed AI-powered soil sensors to maximize wheat yield without compromising on safety. Even the Canadian military got involved, protecting wheat transport infrastructure during peak export seasons, ensuring that no global demand was unmet. And what about consumers? In places like India, Turkey, and Morocco, where bread is a cultural and economic staple, families began to notice differences. Loaves made from Canadian wheat lasted longer, tasted better, had fewer additives. Rumors spread, then proof followed. Canadian wheat wasn't just safer, it was simply better. Bakeries across Cairo hung signs that read, 100% Canadian grain. Pasta makers in Naples advertised their switch to Canadian durum. It became a global marketing edge, and U.S. wheat lost its identity. Inside the U.S., the political pressure reached a boiling point. Town hall meetings turned into shouting matches. Some Midwest states considered forming their own independent quality councils, unwilling to wait for federal agencies to catch up. A few independent co-ops went even further. They partnered with Canadian labs to certify their wheat before export, bypassing domestic red tape. These renegade farmers found new life in the international market, but they were the minority. Most were still locked out of trade channels that had once been theirs by default. What began as a story about grain turned into a story about global realignment, about how complacency can cost a superpower its crown, about how Canada, long considered America's quiet neighbor, stepped up, not with force, but with food. Yet, as global wheat prices fluctuated and Canadian farmers celebrated record profits, one question began to loom. What if Canada can't keep up? What happens when demand outstrips supply? When climate change begins to batter their fields as well? The truth is, no single country can feed the world alone. But trust, once earned, can buy time. Time to expand. Time to innovate. Time to lead. And while America stares down the barrel of reform, its wheat fields whisper a painful truth. Dominance is never guaranteed. It's earned. And when it's lost, it may never come back. There was a time, not long ago, when wheat was so American, it was practically patriotic. Grain silos dotting the Midwest were seen as symbols of strength. Food security meant dominance in the grain market. And for years, America operated like it was untouchable, too big to fail. But now, farmers were dealing with a harsh new reality. The world had moved on, and no one had bothered to leave a forwarding address. Foreign buyers who once sent envoys and negotiators to Chicago were now making daily calls to Winnipeg and Saskatoon. Canadian grain companies couldn't hire fast enough. And where the U.S. once stood as the undisputed leader in grain exports, it now watched from the sidelines, outpaced by a country it never imagined would take its place. For decades, the system that had propped up American wheat had gone unquestioned. Subsidies flowed. Federal inspections were lax. Farmers were paid by the bushel, not by the quality. And when weather conditions got tough, bailouts rolled in. It was a machine that kept running, even when the parts were breaking down. Until one day, the world just didn't want what America was selling anymore. And the effects of that rejection? They weren't just financial. They were cultural. In small towns across the Midwest, places like Hays, Kansas, and Fargo, North Dakota, generations of wheat farmers were forced to confront an identity crisis. The crops their grandparents once grew with pride were now seen as inferior on the global stage. Farmers who once bragged about feeding the world now whispered about unsold inventory and shrinking profits. The coffee shop chatter shifted from crop yields to canceled contracts. Sons who were supposed to inherit family farms now looked for jobs in cities. And for the first time in decades, hope began to dry up faster than the soil in a July drought. Meanwhile, Canadian agriculture was experiencing a renaissance. And it wasn't just about volume, it was about strategy. The Canadian Grain Commission implemented rigorous standards, testing every shipment before it left the country. They invested heavily in grain research, introducing high-gluten, non-GMO varieties that matched the preferences of international bakers and food processors. They expanded rail infrastructure to streamline export routes from inland provinces to port cities. Every move was methodical. Every decision was calculated. And while Canada rose with intention, the U.S. reacted with confusion. The USDA scrambled to impose emergency reforms. Too little, too late. New inspection policies were announced, but implementation was inconsistent. Some ports followed the new protocols, others didn't. And the international community was watching closely. Trust, once broken, requires not only repair, but proof. And the proof wasn't showing up fast enough. One of the most telling episodes came during the World Grain Summit in Geneva. Traditionally dominated by American voices, this year's summit had a new star, Canada. Their agriculture minister delivered a keynote address titled, Sowing Trust, Harvesting Opportunity. It wasn't flashy, but it was sincere. He spoke about transparency, farmer education, consumer safety, and international cooperation. The room applauded. The American delegation, meanwhile, spent much of the conference dodging questions, issuing vague promises, and citing outdated statistics. It was a public relations disaster. But that's not where the humiliation stopped. Weeks later, a high-profile tender from the Egyptian government, a multi-billion-dollar grain contract, explicitly excluded American wheat. The reason? Inconsistent quality control and pesticide residue levels exceeding international benchmarks. Instead, the contract was split between Canada and France. Egypt wasn't just a buyer. It was a bellwether. When Egypt made a move, dozens of other nations followed. And they did. Within months, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Nigeria, and even Mexico, all major importers of American wheat, cut or paused their orders. Some are replacing the U.S. with Canadian suppliers. Others turned to Australia, Ukraine, and even Argentina. But what was clear was this: America was no longer the default option. And as this global shift unfolded, American farmers found themselves stuck in limbo. They couldn't compete on price with nations like Russia or Ukraine. They couldn't compete on quality with Canada or Australia. And they couldn't pivot to specialty markets without massive investment. Many turned to alternative crops, soybeans, corn, even hemp. But those markets had their own volatility. And for some, walking away from wheat felt like walking away from a legacy. But not everyone was ready to surrender. In the heart of Montana, a small coalition of independent farmers banded together to form an export alliance, completely bypassing the traditional grain giants. They partnered with labs in Europe for third-party testing, used blockchain to track and certify crop purity, and even negotiated their own shipping routes through Pacific ports. They weren't just growing wheat, they were rebuilding a reputation. One of those farmers, a fourth-generation grower named Sarah Franklin, said in an interview, "They don't trust the big exporters anymore. But maybe they'll trust me." Sarah's gamble worked. Her wheat, clean, certified, and traceable, found buyers in Germany and the Netherlands. It was a small victory, but it was real, and it sparked something. Other farmers took notice. They started asking questions. Could they do it too? Could they reclaim the narrative, one field at a time? Meanwhile, back in Canada, the government was preparing for a different kind of challenge, managing the pressure of overwhelming demand. Canadian port facilities were pushed to their limits. Rail bottlenecks slowed deliveries. The world wanted more wheat than Canada could grow, and the risk of overextension loomed. In response, Canada began expanding partnerships. They offered seed technology to allied nations, shared farming best practices, entered joint ventures with African cooperatives to build new wheat-growing regions in developing nations. Their strategy was simple: meet global demand, not just by exporting more, but by helping others grow their own. It was food diplomacy at its most intelligent. And yet, for all of Canada's success, the story still comes back to the U.S., to the lessons unlearned, to the opportunity squandered. Because this wasn't just about agriculture. It was about leadership, about listening, about the consequences of ignoring warning signs. For years, inspectors warned of quality issues. Scientists flagged the long-term risks of certain pesticides. Diplomats cautioned against the politicization of food trade. But the warnings were drowned out by lobbyists, by short-term profits, by the belief that dominance could never be lost. But it was quietly, then all at once. And now, the world is eating bread made from different grain, toasting a different kind of success. Still, there remains a sliver of hope. In the scattered fields of Kansas, in the startups in Nebraska, in the co-ops of Oregon, in the labs of Iowa, People are trying, working, learning, fighting to earn back what was lost. It won't be easy, it won't be fast, and it may never fully return to what it was. But the soil remembers. The land is willing. And with the right choices, the seeds of redemption may yet grow. The irony is striking. The United States, the same country that once fed more than a quarter of the global wheat market, is now struggling to feed its own status. While the world's cargo ships queue up at Canadian ports and foreign contracts get inked in Toronto boardrooms, America is caught in a loop of excuses, bureaucracy, and slow-motion recovery. But the truth is unavoidable. The rejection of U.S. wheat was not just a fluke. It was a reflection, a mirror held up to an agricultural empire that grew complacent. It's what happens when legacy is mistaken for guarantee. The ripple effects are not only economic, they're generational. High school agriculture programs in the American Midwest are seeing declining enrollment. Why? Because kids are asking the hard questions their parents never needed to ask. Is there even a future in wheat? Why should I inherit land if it can't support me? Why work a farm when the world says our wheat is second-rate? These aren't just questions, they're warning signs. Meanwhile, Canada is teaching its youth a very different lesson. How to lead with sustainability, how to balance productivity with responsibility, and how to respect the very thing that makes farming possible, trust. There's no denying that global buyers have cast their vote. With their contracts, with their dollars, with their silence toward American offers, and enthusiasm toward Canadian partnerships. It's a market signal that shouts louder than any political ad or trade delegation. Buyers want wheat that meets their standards, not wheat that comes with a press release. And as this wheat war plays out silently between fields and foreign policy, there's a bigger picture emerging, one that has nothing to do with a single grain or a specific country. This is about how nations lose influence not through war, but through neglect, not through revolution, but through assumption. The U.S. assumed it would always be the world's breadbasket, that countries would bend to its agricultural methods, that safety shortcuts wouldn't be noticed, that politics could override quality. But food is a universal need, and no amount of rhetoric can change the fact that a contaminated shipment is still a contaminated shipment. The countries that once quietly accepted less-than-perfect U.S. wheat now have options, and they're not afraid to use them. That's the new reality. It wasn't always like this. Just 10 years ago, the idea of Canada outperforming the U.S. in wheat exports was laughable to many experts. Yet here we are. What once seemed impossible became inevitable because one nation adapted while the other assumed. And if this story carries a final lesson, it's this. In the quiet war for global trust, agriculture is the front line. Every shipment, every seed, every regulation or lack thereof, these are not just domestic decisions. They are international statements, and the world is listening more closely than ever. In this war, no bombs are dropped, no armies are deployed, but there are casualties, jobs lost, communities weakened, futures altered. And the battlefield? It's not in some far-off land. It's in the heartland, on the farms, in the ports, in the silos that now hold grain no one wants. Still, it's not all over. There's a window, small but real. America can still rebuild, not with slogans, but with sincerity. Not with trade deals, but with transparency. By learning from Canada, not competing with it. By embracing change, not resisting it. And by putting farmers, not corporations, at the center of agricultural policy again. But the clock is ticking. Every season lost is another dent in credibility. Every rejected shipment is another nail in the coffin of what used to be. The U.S. can choose to change, or it can cling to a past that no longer exists. In the meantime, the world turns. Bread is baked in Nairobi using Canadian flour. Pasta is made in Bangkok with Saskatchewan wheat. And across the oceans, quiet agreements are being signed that once belonged to the United States. This isn't just a loss of grain, it's a loss of ground, of respect, of relevance. And most painful part, it didn't have to happen. But maybe, just maybe, it doesn't have to stay this way either. Like my video and subscribe my channel for more daily videos.